In 1944, a young Hungarian soldier named Lazlo Kovatch pressed his face against a salt-stained porthole of a converted cargo ship. What he saw through that window would shatter everything he believed about America, about the war he'd been fighting, and about who was really going to win World War II. Henrik! Behind him, packed like cargo, were 800 Hungarian prisoners of war who had surrendered to American forces in Italy. They expected labor camps, hard work, maybe brutal treatment. Instead, they were about to witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What they discovered wasn't just that they had been lied to about America. It was that they had been fighting for the wrong side in a war that was already over. They just didn't know it yet. Today, we're diving into one of the most eye-opening stories of World War II, when enemy soldiers got a front-row seat to America's true industrial might and realized they never stood a chance. Before we begin, if you enjoy deep dives into untold history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. So let's set the scene. It's 1944, and Hungary has been reluctantly allied with Nazi Germany since 1940. Not because they loved the Nazis. They didn't. But because they were trapped between Hitler and Stalin, and they thought Germany was the lesser evil. Lazlo Kovatch was a mechanic from Budapest, conscripted in 1942. Like most Hungarian soldiers, he wasn't fighting for Nazi ideology. He was fighting for what he thought was his country's survival. Hungary had joined the Axis powers not out of fascist conviction, but out of geographical desperation. Sandwiched between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, Hungarian leaders chose what they believed was the lesser of two evils. The alternative, facing the Red Army alone, seemed far worse than partnership with the Wehrmacht. For most Hungarian soldiers, the decision to align with Germany hadn't been born of ideology, but of survival. Lazlo himself had been pulled from his job as a mechanic in Budapest to serve in the Royal Hungarian Army. Like many of his countrymen, he had little love for the Nazis, but he understood the impossible position his nation faced. The Hungarian military had initially performed well in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Hungarian forces had participated in the conquest of Yugoslavia and had fought alongside German troops on the Eastern Front. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, enthusiasm for the German alliance began to wane. By 1944, many Hungarian soldiers were fighting not for victory, but simply for survival. It was during the Italian campaign that Lazlo and his unit encountered American forces for the first time. The Americans had landed in Italy in 1943, and by early 1944, they were pushing northward with a determination and efficiency that caught many Axis forces off guard. The Hungarian Second Army, already weakened by years of fighting on the Eastern Front, found itself outmatched and outgunned. The battle that led to Lazlo's capture lasted only 3 days. American artillery pounded their positions relentlessly while waves of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts strafed their supply lines. The coordination between air and ground forces was unlike anything the Hungarians had experienced. Even the Germans, with their reputation for military precision, seemed crude by comparison. When the American infantry finally advanced, they moved with a confidence that was both impressive and terrifying. Their equipment was superior, their rifles more reliable, their uniforms better made, their vehicles more numerous and better maintained. But it wasn't just the material advantage that struck Lazlo, it was the attitude of the American soldiers themselves. They fought like men who knew they were going to win. The surrender had been swift and surprisingly civilized. Unlike the brutal treatment many prisoners expected based on German propaganda, the Americans had been professional, even courteous. They provided medical care for the wounded, shared their rations with hungry prisoners, and treated captured officers with the respect due their rank. For Lazlo and many of his comrades, this was their first indication that perhaps everything they had been told about America was wrong. Now, what Lazlo saw when that ship approached the Norfolk Naval Base was something that defied everything Hungarian soldiers had been told about America. Remember, Nazi propaganda had painted America as a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, unprepared for modern warfare. What he actually saw was a harbor filled with more warships than existed in the entire German Navy. Destroyers, cruisers, and massive aircraft carriers stretched as far as the eye could see. And here's the kicker. This was just one American port. The Norfolk Naval Base was a revelation of industrial might that defied comprehension. Massive dry docks housed ships under construction, their skeletal frames rising like the ribs of steel whales. Cranes moved with mechanical precision, lifting sections of hull plating that would have taken weeks to produce in Hungarian shipyards if Hungary had shipyards capable of such work at all. But it wasn't just the ships that amazed the prisoners, it was everything else. The harbor was alive with activity that spoke of a nation fully mobilized for war, yet somehow untouched by its devastation. Unlike the bombed-out ports of Europe, Norfolk showed no signs of enemy attack. The infrastructure was intact. The workers moved with purpose rather than desperation. And there was an abundance of everything: fuel, steel, concrete, rubber that had become precious commodities in Axis-controlled Europe. The prisoners expected brutal treatment. They'd been fed horror stories about American prison camps. Instead, they were processed with mechanical efficiency, everything documented, cataloged, filed in triplicate. The bureaucratic machinery of the American war effort was as overwhelming as its industrial capacity. The truck convoy that transported them inland provided another shock. The roads were paved and well-maintained, unlike the rutted tracks that passed for highways in much of war-torn Europe. Traffic moved in both directions: military convoys heading toward the ports, civilian vehicles going about their daily business. The sight of ordinary Americans driving cars for personal use was almost surreal to men who came from a continent where gasoline was rationed and private automobiles had largely disappeared from the roads. But perhaps most shocking of all was the sheer abundance of everything. Billboards advertised consumer goods that hadn't been available in Europe for years. Restaurants displayed signs promising steaks and coffee, luxuries that had become distant memories for most Europeans. Even the military vehicles looked well-fed, if such a thing could be said about machines. The trucks were new, the jeeps were clean, and everything seemed to work exactly as it was supposed to. Lazlo found himself sitting next to Peter Sabau, a sergeant from his old unit who had been captured in the same battle. Peter had been a factory worker before the war, and his eyes were wide as he took in the industrial landscape rolling past their truck windows. "Look at those factories," he whispered, pointing to a complex of buildings stretching to the horizon. Smokestacks rose like a forest of concrete trees, and the sound of machinery hummed in the distance. "They're not even damaged." How was that possible? It was a question that haunted many of the prisoners. In Europe, every major industrial center bore the scars of bombing raids. Factories operated at reduced capacity, constantly repairing damage from air attacks. Supply chains were disrupted, raw materials were scarce, and workers lived in constant fear of the next raid. But here, thousands of miles from any enemy bomber, American industry operated at full capacity, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The prisoner of war camp that would become their home for the duration of the war was located in rural Virginia, surrounded by farmland that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The camp itself was like a small city, with rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, recreation facilities, and even a small hospital. It was clean, well-organized, and surprisingly comfortable. The contrast with the stories they had heard about Soviet prison camps was stark. But it was during their first meal that the full impact of American abundance truly hit home. The mess halls served portions that would have been considered generous even in peacetime Europe. There was meat, real meat, not the ersatz substitutes that had become common in Germany and its allies. There were fresh vegetables, white bread, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee. For men who had been living on increasingly meager rations for months, it was almost overwhelming. "This is how they feed their prisoners," Lazlo murmured to Peter as they sat at one of the long wooden tables. "What do you think they feed their own soldiers?" It was a question that would be answered in the coming weeks as the prisoners began to interact with their American guards. The guards were well-fed, well-equipped, and surprisingly well-educated. Many spoke multiple languages, and some had attended universities, a luxury that was available to only a small elite in most European countries. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who represented a nation that was not just winning the war, but winning it decisively. The camp library was another revelation. It contained thousands of books in multiple languages, including Hungarian. There were technical manuals, works of literature, and even recent magazines and newspapers. The prisoners were encouraged to read, to learn English, and to participate in educational programs. It was a level of intellectual freedom that many had not experienced even before the war. But perhaps most shocking of all was the mail system. Within weeks of their arrival, the prisoners were allowed to write letters home, subject to censorship, but otherwise unrestricted. The letters that came back from Hungary painted a picture of a country under increasing strain. Food was scarce, fuel was almost non-existent, and the constant threat of bombing had driven many families into basements and shelters. The contrast with their own situation was almost surreal. As the weeks turned into months, the prisoners began to understand that what they were witnessing was not just American military power, but American industrial and organizational capacity on a scale that dwarfed anything in Europe. The United States was not just fighting a war on multiple fronts. It was doing so while simultaneously maintaining a standard of living that most Europeans could barely imagine. The numbers, when they learned them, were staggering. American factories were producing aircraft at a rate of 1 every 5 minutes. Shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. The production of tanks, trucks, weapons, and ammunition was increasing every month, not decreasing as it was in Germany and its allies. And all of this was happening in a country that remained physically untouched by the war. But it wasn't just the scale of production that impressed the prisoners. It was the quality and sophistication of American equipment. The Guards carried Hungarian rifles that were semi-automatic, giving them a significant advantage over the bolt-action rifles used by most European armies. Their uniforms were made from high-quality materials and were designed for comfort as well as durability. Even their helmets were better designed and more protective than anything the Hungarians had been issued. The technological superiority extended beyond personal equipment. The prisoners learned that American forces were using radar to detect enemy aircraft and ships, a technology that was still in its infancy in most other countries. They had developed proximity fuses that made their anti-aircraft guns far more effective. Their communications equipment was more reliable and more sophisticated than anything in the German arsenal. But perhaps most impressive of all was the American approach to logistics. The Guards explained how supplies were moved from American factories to battlefields around the world with a precision and efficiency that was almost mechanical. Ships, trains, trucks, and aircraft worked in coordination to ensure that American forces never lacked for ammunition, food, fuel, or equipment. It was a level of organizational sophistication that made the German war machine look primitive by comparison. 3 weeks later, the prisoners were taken on what the camp commander called an educational tour of a nearby aircraft factory. The stated purpose was to demonstrate American industrial methods as part of their re-education program. But Lazlo suspected there was another motive, to show them exactly what they had been fighting against. The bus ride to the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation plant in Norfolk took 40 minutes through countryside that looks like something from a peacetime postcard. Farms stretched to the horizon, their fields green and productive, worked by tractors that seemed almost luxuriously large compared to the horse-drawn plows still common in rural Hungary. There were no bomb craters, no destroyed bridges, no burned-out vehicles rusting in ditches. The war might as well have been happening on another planet. "Look at that," whispered Janos Molnar, a former teacher from Debrecen who sat across the aisle. He pointed to a group of children walking to school, their clothes clean and well-fitted, carrying lunch boxes and books. When was the last time you saw children who looked that well-fed? It was a sobering observation. In Hungary and throughout German-occupied Europe, children had grown thin and pale during the war years. Malnutrition was common, schools had been converted to military use, and childhood itself had become a casualty of the conflict. But here, American children continued their education as if the world wasn't burning around them. The aircraft factory, when it came into view, defied comprehension. The main assembly building was larger than any structure Lazlo had ever seen, a cathedral of steel and glass that stretched for what seemed like miles. The parking lot alone was bigger than most Hungarian towns, filled with thousands of automobiles belonging to the workers. The sight of so many private cars was almost as shocking as the factory itself. Inside, the scale became even more overwhelming. The assembly line stretched the length of the building, with partially completed B-24 Liberator bombers moving along it like massive mechanical caterpillars. Workers swarmed over each aircraft with practiced efficiency, installing engines, wiring instruments, and weapon systems. The noise was tremendous, the sound of riveting guns, power tools, and machinery operating at full capacity. But it wasn't just the size that impressed the prisoners. It was the precision and organization of the operation. Every worker seemed to know exactly what they were doing and when to do it. Parts arrived at each station exactly when needed. Tools were organized with military precision, and the entire process flowed with a rhythm that spoke of months or years of refinement. The factory supervisor, a middle-aged man named Robert Harrison, served as their guide. He spoke with obvious pride about the plant's capabilities, rattling off production statistics that seemed almost impossible to believe. "We're currently producing one B-24 every 63 minutes, he explained, his voice carrying over the industrial din. "Last month, we delivered 387 completed aircraft to the Army Air Forces. Next month, we expect to exceed 400. Lazlo did quick mental calculations and felt his stomach drop. This single factory was producing more aircraft in a month than the entire Hungarian Air Force had possessed at the start of the war. And this was just one plant among dozens scattered across the United States. The implications were staggering. The workers themselves were another revelation. Unlike the tired, undernourished laborers Lazlo had seen in German factories, these Americans looked healthy and energetic. Many were women, working jobs that would have been considered exclusively male in most European countries. They operated complex machinery with confidence and skill, and they seemed to take genuine pride in their work. During the lunch break, the prisoners were allowed to eat in the factory cafeteria alongside the workers. The meal was simple but abundant, sandwiches made with real meat, fresh fruit, milk, and coffee. As they ate, some of the American workers struck up conversations with the prisoners, curious about their experiences and eager to practice their limited German or broken Hungarian. "You guys really thought you could beat us?" asked a young woman named Betty who worked on the electrical systems. Her question wasn't hostile, just genuinely puzzled. "I mean, we're making planes faster than you can shoot them down. How did you think that was going to work out?" It was a fair question, and one that Lazlo had been asking himself for weeks. The propaganda they had been fed about American industrial weakness now seemed not just wrong, but criminally deceptive. The reality was that America was outproducing the entire Axis combined, and the gap was widening every month. After lunch, they toured the engine production facility, where Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines were assembled with clockwork precision. Each engine required thousands of precisely machined parts, and the quality control standards were higher than anything Lazlo had seen in European manufacturing. Engines were tested extensively before installation, and any that failed to meet specifications were completely rebuilt. "We can't afford to have engines failing over enemy territory," explained the chief engineer, a soft-spoken man named David Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China. "Every bomber that goes down represents not just the loss of expensive equipment, but the lives of 10 crew members. We take that responsibility seriously." The casual mention of immigrant workers was another small shock. In Nazi-dominated Europe, racial purity had become an obsession, with elaborate theories about the superiority of certain ethnic groups. But here was a Chinese American in a position of significant responsibility, working alongside colleagues of every conceivable background. The factory workforce included recent immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Mexico, all working together toward a common goal. The afternoon brought a visit to the testing facility, where completed aircraft underwent final inspections before delivery to combat units. Test pilots put each bomber through its paces, checking everything from engine performance to weapon systems. The thoroughness of the process was impressive, but what struck Lazlo most was the casual competence of the pilots themselves. These weren't the elite aces that Germany had been forced to rely on as the war progressed. They were ordinary Americans who had learned to fly in training programs that seemed to produce pilots as efficiently as the factories produced aircraft. The United States wasn't just building planes faster than its enemies could destroy them. It was training crews faster than its enemies could kill them. The bus ride back to camp was unusually quiet. The prisoners sat in contemplative silence, each processing what they had witnessed in their own way. The scale of American industrial might was one thing, but the implications were something else entirely. This wasn't just about winning the current war. It was about reshaping the entire global balance of power. That evening, as the prisoners gathered in the recreation hall, conversations inevitably turned to what they had seen. Peter Sabau, the former factory worker, seemed particularly troubled. "I've worked in manufacturing my entire adult life," he said, shaking his head slowly. "What we saw today, it's not just bigger than anything in Europe. It's more advanced. They're not just out producing us, they're out thinking us." The observation sparked a heated discussion among the prisoners. Some argued that German engineering was still superior, that American equipment was quantity over quality. But those arguments rang increasingly hollow in the face of what they had witnessed. The B-24s rolling off that assembly line weren't crude wartime expedients when they were sophisticated machines built to exacting standards. Major Istvan Horvath, the senior Hungarian officer in the camp, had been notably quiet during the factory tour. Now he spoke up, his voice heavy with the weight of professional military assessment. "Gentlemen, we need to face facts. We've been fighting the wrong war against the wrong enemy. The Americans aren't just defeating us militarily, they're demonstrating a completely different approach to warfare." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "In Europe, we think of war as a test of will, of courage, of tactical brilliance, but the Americans have turned war into an industrial process. They're not trying to outfight us, they're trying to produce us, and they're succeeding." The major's words carried particular weight because of his background. Before the war, he had served as a military attaché in Berlin, where he had been impressed by German organizational efficiency and technological innovation. He had believed, as many did, that German military science represented the pinnacle of modern warfare. The American approach seemed almost unsporting by comparison, winning through sheer material superiority rather than tactical brilliance. But effectiveness, as the major was beginning to understand, mattered more than elegance. The Americans weren't interested in fighting fair, they were interested in winning decisively and quickly. Every B-24 that rolled off that assembly line represented not just firepower, but strategic thinking on a scale that dwarfed European military planning. But what happened next would shatter their understanding not just of American power, but of democracy itself. Because 3 months into their captivity, they received visitors that no prisoner of war in authoritarian Europe could ever have imagined. A delegation of American congressmen arrived to inspect the prison camp. Not military officials, elected representatives of the American people, come to ensure that tax dollars were being spent properly and that prisoners were being treated according to American values. The delegation arrived on a crisp October morning, their convoy of black sedans kicking up dust as they approached the camp gates. Lazlo watched from his barracks window as American congressmen emerged from their vehicles, straightening their suits and adjusting their ties. These were the elected representatives of the American people, come to inspect a prisoner of war facility as if it were any other government operation subject to civilian oversight. The very concept was alien to most of the Hungarian prisoners. In their experience, military operations were the exclusive domain of military authorities, beyond the reach of civilian politicians except at the very highest levels. The idea that elected representatives could simply decide to visit a POW camp, ask questions, and demand answers was a revelation about the nature of American democracy. Congressman Robert Taft of Ohio led the delegation. a serious man with wire-rimmed glasses who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. Beside him walked Congressman Lyndon Johnson of Texas, younger and more energetic, his eyes constantly moving as he took in every detail of the camp's operation. The group included representatives from both political parties, a fact that the camp commander, Colonel William Hayes, took care to emphasize during his welcoming remarks. "Gentlemen," Colonel Hayes announced to the assembled prisoners, "these congressmen represent the American people who are funding this facility and your care. They have come to ensure that we are treating you in accordance with the Geneva Convention and American values. You are free to speak with them directly about your treatment here." The invitation to speak freely with government officials was perhaps the most shocking thing the prisoners had heard since their arrival. In Hungary and throughout Nazi-controlled Europe, prisoners of war were the exclusive concern of military authorities. The idea that civilian politicians would take personal interest in their welfare, or that prisoners would be encouraged to voice complaints directly to government officials, was unprecedented. Congressman Taft approached the group of Hungarian officers first, his manner formal but not unfriendly. "I understand you gentlemen have been here for several months now," he said in careful German. "How have you been treated? Do you have any complaints about your accommodations or the conduct of American personnel?" Major Horvath seemed uncertain how to respond. In his military experience, such questions from high-ranking officials were usually traps designed to identify troublemakers or test loyalty. But the congressman's manner suggested genuine interest in their welfare, not an attempt to catch them in some form of disloyalty. "Sir," the major replied carefully, "we have been treated with great courtesy and in full accordance with international law. The food is adequate, the medical care is excellent, and the American personnel have conducted themselves with professionalism." Congressman Johnson stepped forward, his approach more informal than his colleagues. "Major, I appreciate the diplomatic answer, but I'm asking for your honest assessment. Are there things we could be doing better? Problems we should know about?" The directness of the question caught the major off guard. In his experience, government officials didn't ask for honest assessments from prisoners of war. They issued orders, made pronouncements, and expected compliance. The idea that American congressmen genuinely wanted feedback about government operations was another small revolution in his understanding of how democratic societies functioned. "Well," the major said hesitantly, "we could use more books in Hungarian, and perhaps some of the men would benefit from more structured activities. They have time to think, and thinking can be difficult for soldiers far from home." Congressman Taft made notes in a small leather notebook, treating the major's suggestions as seriously as he might treat recommendations from a fellow government official. "We'll look into expanding the library holdings," he said. "What kind of structured activities would be most beneficial?" The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with the congressman asking detailed questions about everything from food quality to mail delivery to recreational facilities. They spoke with enlisted men as well as officers, and their questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of the psychological challenges facing prisoners of war. More importantly, they seemed genuinely committed to ensuring that American facilities met the highest possible standards. But it was during the tour of the camp facilities that the prisoners received their most profound lesson in American governance. As they walked through the mess hall, Congressman Johnson stopped to examine the kitchen equipment and food storage areas. He asked detailed questions about meal planning, nutritional content, and food costs, taking notes that would clearly find their way into official reports. "The American taxpayers are funding this operation," he explained to the prisoners who had gathered to observe the inspection. "They have a right to know that their money is being spent wisely and that we are upholding American values, even in our treatment of enemy soldiers." That's what democracy means. Government officials are accountable to the people, not the other way around. The concept of government accountability was another revelation for men who had lived under authoritarian rule. In Hungary, government officials were accountable only to their superiors, ultimately to the regent or the German authorities. The idea that elected representatives felt obligated to justify their actions to ordinary citizens was a fundamental inversion of the power relationships the prisoners had always known. The afternoon brought an even more extraordinary experience, a town hall meeting where the prisoners were invited to ask questions of the congressman about American government, society, and war aims. The meeting was held in the camp's recreation hall, with prisoners seated on folding chairs facing a simple table where the congressman sat without ceremony or special protection. Dr. Nagy, the former university professor, raised his hand first. Congressman, we have been told that America is fighting for democracy and freedom. But what does this mean in practical terms? What kind of world do you envision after the war? Congressman Taft leaned forward, his expression serious. Doctor, that's the fundamental question of our time. No. We believe that people have the right to choose their own governments, to speak freely, to practice their religion, and to pursue economic opportunity without interference from authoritarian regimes. We're fighting not just to defeat fascism, but to create a world where small nations like Hungary can determine their own destiny. The answer prompted a flurry of questions from other prisoners. What about Soviet influence in Eastern Europe? Would America help rebuild war-torn countries? How could democratic principles be applied in societies that had no experience with self-government? The congressman answered each question thoughtfully, acknowledging the complexities and challenges while maintaining their fundamental commitment to democratic principles. But what struck the prisoners most was the tone of the discussion. These were not pronouncements from on high, but conversations between equals. The congressman treated the prisoners' questions as legitimate and important, worthy of serious consideration and honest answers. You know, Congressman Johnson said at one point, you gentlemen have experienced something that most Americans never will. You've seen what happens when democratic societies mobilize for war. The American war effort wasn't characterized by the brutal efficiency they had expected from authoritarian propaganda. Instead, it seemed to flow from a society that had voluntarily organized itself for war while maintaining its fundamental character. But increasingly, it was because they were beginning to see their participation as an investment in the kind of future they hoped to see after the war. Working alongside American civilians provided another education in democratic society. People could choose their destiny if they had the courage to seize the opportunity when it came. The war would end in a few months, and with it would come new challenges and new opportunities.